Waiting. Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun when the pandemic hit and shuttered indie bookstores. I also want to say that we all want to make sure that you all put the upcoming Salem Literary Festival on your calendars for September 8th to 11th. It's a Blaze favorite, and the Lit Festival is presented by the Salem Athenaeum and has been inspiring writers and readers from around the world since 2008. This year's festival is really big. It's going to be over 50 noted authors, including Alex Harrow, Lev Grossman, Jennifer Lynn Barnes, and Jasmine Chan. With adult, young adult, and children's programming on offer, there's something for every lit letter. My co-founder, Jenna Blum, will be kicking off her in-person event on Friday, September 9th, and I will be on a virtual panel Sunday, September 11th at 2. This year's festival will also include a mix of in-person and virtual programming. Check out the schedule at salemlitfest.org and follow them on your favorite social channels. I have put those social channels up on the comments, and there we go. So today I'm really excited because we have Andrea Buchanan. Not only has she written just about my favorite book of all time, Five Part Invention. It's truly a masterpiece, truly a masterwork, but she's also an amazing, amazing person and friend, and I just adore her. Before becoming a writer, Andrea trained as a pianist, earning a Bachelor of Music degree in piano performance from the Boston Conservatory of Music and a master's in piano performance from the San Francisco Conservatory. Her last recital was at Carnegie Hall. She is currently executive director of the Spinal Csf Leak Foundation. I've also put that link in the chat for you, and we'll be putting it up on the banner. Before becoming a writer, Andy trained as a pianist. Oh, I already said that already. I'm sorry. Her memoir, The Beginning of Everything, about her experiences with Spinal Csf Leak, was a finalist for the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Award for Literary Science Writing. In 2020, her essay, Two Hearts, published by the Kenyon Review, was named a notable essay in Best American Essays. Her other work includes the multimedia young adult novel, Gift, named one of Kirkus Review's best books of 2012. And I'm telling you, this is a big deal because Kirkus is notoriously cranky. The international best-selling The Daring Book for Girls, which is just wonderful. Her essay collection on early motherhood, Mother Shock, Loving Every Other Minute of It, and 7 other books. Five Part Invention, her latest, is about inherited trauma, how and why it's passed down through 5 generations of extraordinary women. It's also about how we create art and how we really create ourselves. And it's truly magnificent. I was just so enthralled by this book. It's a masterwork. I'm not the only one who thinks so. Jennifer Finney Boylan says, Buchanan's novel investigates the sacrifices we make to create art, as well as to become ourselves. This is a story of the way mothers create a kind of music in their daughters and build, through our love, an orchestra of souls. That's beautiful. Generous, inspiring, and wise. So welcome, Andy. I'm so happy to have you here. I'm thrilled to be talking about your book, and you can see the beautiful cover right behind you. Hold on, I'm going to get rid of this phone call. I forgot to close my phone. Okay, I always want to know what was haunting a writer or obsessing them into writing their novels. Tell us what the inception story for Five Part Invention is.
Yeah, you know, this novel did haunt me for a very long time, almost 20 years. But basically, the impetus for me was really a set of paintings that I discovered in my then in-law's basement. Just kind of poking around, and I came across a treasure trove of paintings from the 1930s, and some of them were industrial scenes, and some of them were, you know, portraits, still lifes, and then there were a whole bunch of sketches and paintings of a woman. And I was just so intrigued by it. And my then in-laws at the time told me that these were all from my mother-in-law's uncle, who had been a painter in the WPA era, and the woman in the paintings was me. And they told me that she was also an artist, but he was jealous of the attention that she gave to her piano practicing, and he forbade her to play. And in real life, she agreed to not play anymore. And in fact, she didn't play again until he was dead and she was in a nursing home that had a piano in the 1970s. So she spent, 40 years not playing.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, and just something about it, I just got chills hearing the story and looking through all the documents that they'd saved, all the photographs. And there was a picture that I found of the two of them from the 1920s, and on the back in a feminine script it had said "Our First Summer." And then towards the end of the night, I found a photo from them from the 1970s. They were very much older, and on the back it said in the same script "Our Last Summer," and then it had a question mark, and the question mark had been erased. And for
wow,
me, it was so poignant because I felt like that question mark was about so much more than, was this their last time together? It seemed to me that for this woman, there had just been so many years of question marks and questions unasked and questions unanswered. And so I just knew that I had to write about it, but I didn't know how to write about it. So I started here and there and just kind of lived with the story or came, to kind of just live with it and see what I could come up with in terms of writing a better kind of story for her. I wanted her to have a better ending than having to wait 40 years to be the artist that she wanted to be.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And you said something really interesting about you didn't know how to write it, because I think for all the writers out there, that's always our problem, right? We have an idea, and then it's not just to have the idea, it's like figuring out the right structure, which I think you did. And I loved the structure because it actually is like a 5-part invention. It's a very musical book. So can you tell us how that structure came about?
Sure. Yeah. Well, for many years, for maybe a dozen years as I worked on it, it was really just Lisa's story. In the final version of this, we hear Lisa's story as in the form of a letter that she's writing to her daughter, Anna, and it's kind of woven throughout the book. But for a long time, that was the whole book. It was just basically focusing on 2 weeks in the life of this woman who was trying to fight to be able to be an artist and play piano. And, I kept getting feedback from editors saying, we love this, we love the writing, we love the concept, but it's so small. And at first I thought,
Small?
Life is so small. Like what?
Really?
But then I thought about, how can I expand this? So I did another version. I changed it from third person to first person. And, I did some other things. I tried to expand the world a little bit, but it was still kind of just still that universe. And then I thought, okay, fine. You want big? I'll go big. I started thinking about, what would happen? What happens to her after the ending of, this kind of capsule story that I was writing? How does the choices that she learns that she's making affect her in the rest of her life? What kind of mother would she be? And, as somebody who, the first part of my writing career was really focused on motherhood and feminism and parenting. Mm-hmm. That seemed like a really interesting thing to explore. And so I came up with the idea of kind of a cascading generations, and each mother-daughter pair kind of trying to figure out the context for how they live and what they do and how they feel and the choices they make, and just the ways in which we try to understand ourselves without understanding the full story of our family in a full context. So that was how it ended up. But it started with one story, ended up being 5 voices.
I love that. I mean, I always love it when I read books from writers I admire and they do something. And my first instinct is, oh my God, how did they do that? And then my next is, how can I do that?
Right.
How can I learn from this to do that? Because it was done so well. So all of these women suffer from being separated from their means of expression, which to me is the most horrible thing in the world. Something which actually filters down with their relationships with their daughters. And science tells us that pain and trauma is in the cells, that it actually can be handed down. So we start with Lise, who's the pianist whose cruel husband keeps her from doing her art. Then we have Anna, her daughter, then Pauline, who yearns for a different mother, and then Hope, who has a mysterious illness, but goes to music school. And we end with Zoe in 2020, who also reinvents herself by coming out as trans. So what I was wondering, like all of these things as they're shifting down through time are just perfection. And I was wondering, did you figure this out before you wrote it? I mean, are you the kind of person where you have charts and graphs, or did it just sort of organically come out of the writing?
A little bit of both. If I plan too much, if I plot out, then in a way, as a writer, my brain is just like, oh, we're done. You know what I mean? I feel like, oh, I've told
Right.
So I tend to dive in and write and then stand back and conceptualize a little bit. But I had an idea. I had, a story for Anna that I knew I wanted to tell. I had a story for Hope that I knew I wanted to tell. I had a voice for Zoe that I knew I wanted to bring out. And Pauline's was the harder one to figure out. But yeah, I knew kind of going in what I wanted to do. And then it was just a matter of seeing what happened as I went along and then standing back and kind of seeing how it all fit in together and seeing how I could weave everything in a way that, made it coherent and make sense.
What's the writing process like for you? Do you get like crazy, or do you get frustrated, or is it smooth, or do you all ever feel like I'm giving this up and I'm going to be a dentist? I mean, what's that like for you?
Well, I always tell people that the best process is the one that gets the book done, right?
Right.
And the second thing I usually tell people is that each book that you write teaches you how to write that book.
Yes.
So I feel like, each book I write teaches me about how to write itself as I go along. And some of those things can transfer to the next book, but not always. This book, I knew from the beginning, I had this sense early on, 20 years ago, that I was going to have to write my way up to it. I felt like I was not ready to write it the way it needed to be written at the time when I first started writing it. And I just kind of worked on it off and on over the years. So this book was kind of an anomaly, because usually my process is I write very fast and I write pretty clean and then it's done. And this was not like that. The book before this memoir was also very different. It was hard. It was really, it wasn't easy. It wasn't fun. I realized, like, oh, right, this is the part where I'm learning how to write this book. And the lesson is it's not going to be easy. And the lesson with Five-Part Invention was that it was going to take time. So, my writing process for it was different, because I started writing it when my children were young. I had to write in like snatches of moments.
Right.
When children were asleep or I was up in the middle of the night, and kind of cobbled together some ideas before they slipped away. And then later, as I was working on it when my children were older and I had more time, then I could really focus in and devote more time to it. But it's definitely unlike anything. The process is unlike anything I ever worked on before, just in terms of its length and the kind of the patience it took on me as a writer to not give up on it.
Right. And that's an important thing that I always say for me, there's always a first chapter rule. If I can get out a first chapter I cannot quit, no matter how bad the rest of the book is. So, we have an audience question. What's the difference between the stories you tell others and the stories you tell ourselves? Which is a great question, actually, because there's a lot of that in this novel. All of these women tell themselves stories, and they're told stories of how they're supposed to be. So can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, regarding the book, in fact, there is a fairy tale that's woven throughout the book that all of the daughters are told by mothers, and it's pretty gruesome. And we see each successive generation kind of interprets and reconstructs, and in some cases rewrites that fairy tale for themselves. And in the last section with, Zoe, a high school senior applying to college in 2020, she has a lot of explicit conversations with her mother about the kinds of stories, the bad stories we tell ourselves, and how important it is to counter it with a good story. And one of the important things she notes is that, a bad story can take root very quickly, and a good story, sometimes you have to tell yourself the good story 10, 20, 30, 40 times before it even starts to sink in. And I do feel like that personally. Definitely the stories that I tell myself are way crueler and less generous than other people people, and I think to some extent we can all relate to that,
Yes, absolutely. We absolutely do. There's a quote in the book that I absolutely loved, which was, or maybe it was from an interview with you, but no matter. It says, "Do we suffer for our art, or does our art suffer because of us or because of others?" And again, I think that's germane to your book. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this notion, at least kind of in our culture, that like real art involves suffering, that there has to be some sort of inciting event, that there has to be something that you convert into meaning. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but it is something that was a focus of five-part invention. Lisa's husband, Moore, the artist in the 1930s, was definitely suffering from untreated mental illness and narcissism, and the difficulties of being an artist during the Depression. And his whole impetus was to make meaning of his art. For Lisa too, her suffering was because she wasn't allowed to make her art. For later characters in the Hope, but also struggling with making art and bringing meaning to it and trying to understand it when it seems so remote from her actual daily life experience. Playing pieces from composers 200 years ago. How is that relevant to me? How can I make that matter? But I think it's tricky to believe that good art can only come from suffering. I think it's a way to kind of, in a way, diminish the suffering, to say, well, oh, you got this out of it in the end. And also really shuts people down from trying to create, because they think, well, what story do I have to tell? I didn't really suffer. I didn't really have this terrible thing happen. What do I have to say? And I think we can look beyond that in terms of honoring the experiences we have, especially if you're writing, personal essays, memoir, creative nonfiction. There are ways to turn your stories into something readable for other people that doesn't have to involve you performatively suffering.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's absolutely right. There's so much music in this book, and it's so beautiful. It's almost musically written, and you yourself are a musician, a pianist. What I wanted to know is, how does being a musician differ from being a novelist for you? Are there any similarities? Does one feed the other or inform the other? And if so, how?
I mean, there's definitely some similarities. I mean, when you're a pianist, you spend most of your life in the practice room alone, working on something over and over until you produce it, perform it for somebody. And that's very similar to the kind of work a writer does, writing alone, wordlessly, except soundlessly, and then presenting a finished, manuscripts for people to read and enjoy, hopefully. But there are some things that are very different. If you're a classical musician, especially, then you're working on music that's already written, and your job is to interpret the messages the composer has left you in the form of all the musical articulation and dynamics and all the clues that are on the page. And your job is to faithfully express that in the best way for that composer and their style. Whereas in writing, you might be trying to be faithful to an idea you have, but there aren't always those kinds of guideposts in terms of interpreting somebody else's intent. It's more, up to you. But I will say that a lot of the things that I learned in music school about listening and about nuance and about technique, all of that stuff, even though it's very specific to piano playing, it does transfer for me to the writing process, especially about the kind of the editorial part of standing back and seeing, does this work? Does it just work inside my head? Does this work for other people? What can I do? What's a through line here? What is the connection? Looking in music or piano, I'm always looking for connections within a piece to, inner voices to bring out, phrases to emphasize that relate to each other. And I'm looking for the same things as I'm writing. What can I connect here that is surprising, that maybe you wouldn't expect? So I do think there's a lot that the two things have in common.
You have a couple of audience questions. The first one is, what surprised you in the process of writing this novel?
A lot, actually. Well, first, at a certain point when you've been working on something so long, it almost becomes like a joke. Is this something I'm ever going to be able to finish? So I was actually surprised that I was finally able to finish it, because at a certain point when people are like, are you still working on that? but also, I think writing a book is there's so much, it's just a little bit of magic involved when everything comes together. When you go from the jump between having an idea and a concept and then how it ends up on the page, like they're totally different things, but you can still kind of get where you wanted to go in the end. I think what surprised me a lot was how it all ended up working, even though I thought, is this, 4 short stories wrapped inside a novella? Is this too weird a structure? And in the end, being able to get through the whole thing and have it all pieced together and realize, like, oh, okay, that's actually not what I had in mind, but this works even better than I thought. That was surprising. I feel like there's so much of the writing process that's surprising once you kind of let go of the story you have of how it's supposed to go.
Right, absolutely. And we have another question from Licha. I hope I'm pronouncing your lovely name right. It's a beautiful name. What inspired you to become an artist? Oh, I meant that to be a question mark. Sorry.
I actually learned to read and write when I was really young, way before I started, taking piano lessons. And so, writing was always how I processed things, worked out my problems. Writing was always how I came to understand myself as a young diarist, or writing in journals and writing little stories and things like that. So I think I'd always thought of myself as, like, someday I would like to be a writer. And when I started doing piano more seriously, I kind of had a crossroads moment. Do I go to conservatory and study piano? Do I go to college and study English? And I figured I would probably always be able to write, but I would never be able to be like 17 and be able to study with these teachers and have this experience. So I went to the conservatory, and being there was very different. Everybody was so focused on the one thing that they did, and nobody cared that I also liked to write. They only cared if I played piano well,
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Like, trying to think of I always had thought of myself as like a person who did a lot of things, but in music school, really focusing in, I had to think, like, am I an artist? Am I a pianist? Am I a writer? Am I an artist? What does that mean? So yeah, it's I guess it's something that I've thought about my whole life, but I'm glad to have been able to combine both music and writing.
Right. I was going to say, you can go under the umbrella term. You're an artist, and that encompasses a lot of different things. I wanted to ask you, in the book, 5 Part Invention, buy it from your local indie or go to bookshop.org. The link is in the chat. In the book, it raises the question, what's the purpose of art? Some people feel it's private. Perhaps it should be public. Should it be for political purposes? At one point, a character in the book actually says, no one deserves to make art, but nevertheless, art is required. I love that. I love that statement. What do you think? What do you think about all this? I would love to know.
I mean, I think it's tricky, having gone to, there is that difference between, like, creating art for yourself and creating art for fun and creating art for your job. Having been in, like, the professional classical music world and then the publishing world, there's a huge difference between, the things that you create that are for you to learn something about yourself, and the things that you might create for an audience. I mean, I do agree with what the that character said. It's not that you deserve to make art, but for some people especially, it is a drive, and it is, it's meaningful, and it doesn't matter whether there's critical acclaim or money
Right,
or
right.
that. It's just, you have to do it because this is how you understand the world.
Right, right. I think that's exactly true. And I think it's also, there's always the myth. You were talking about the myths of the struggling writer or the crazy writer. But I also think that being able to write is very therapeutic. Not that writing should be therapy, but you get to go dig down into your deepest parts, some of the darker parts, and bring them up. And that makes you feel better.
Yeah.
That makes you feel better. You have another audience question.
Okay.
Let me just find it. Sorry. Again, this is from Licha Haney. Who has been your hardest character to write about and why?
I think in this book, definitely it was Pauline. So Pauline is Lisa's great granddaughter. No, yeah, granddaughter. Sorry. Anna is Pauline's mom. Lisa is Anna's mom. She was probably the last section I was really kind of still tinkering with till the very end, because I wasn't sure what her focus should be. So as I said before, Lisa's voice throughout the thing is in the form of a letter to her daughter, Anna. And then we see in Anna's section, we see snapshots of her life from 1956, 1958, 1960, years, little snapshots, peeks into her life. Pauline's section takes place all in one terrible afternoon for Pauline. Hope's section takes place over 2 weeks of spring break in the early 90s. And Zoe's section takes place, is in the form of Common App essays applying to college in 2020. So I wanted each one to have a different kind of structure, and I hit upon the idea of just one very bad day.
I love that. I love that.
Kind of encapsulate, we're really zooming into a snapshot of Pauline at her worst. And it was really hard because I wanted to draw on lots of details from stories that I'd had in my own personal life or that I knew about, but I didn't want to caricature this person. And in the end, I actually feel like with Pauline, especially, even though a lot of people have said like, oh gosh, I hope I'm not the Pauline in my friend group. I ended up having a lot of compassion for Pauline because I really just channeled like my cringiest self, like I think we all, whenever we write, we're writing everything through our own.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, it was a challenge. I wanted to, how do you write somebody who's kind of in crisis or maybe unlikable in a way that's really sympathetic and ultimately, that you have compassion for. So she was a tricky needle to thread, but I'm happy with.
Well, I think you did that, and that we came to understand her and all the forces that all the things she was forced to survive and go through. And that doesn't matter if she's quote unquote unlikable, because she's deeply sympathetic because we understand her. Right. So there you go. So I really wanted to ask about the women's separation from the need for creative expression, which impacts their relationships with their daughters in a not good way. I'm asking this because I remember when I got pregnant 26 years ago, some other writers warned me, it's going to kill your writing. Why did you do that? And there's some famous quote from some writer, I forget who said it, but she said when she was pregnant, there goes another book. Like there goes another book. For me, actually, being pregnant and having children enhanced my creativity in a lot of ways. And I was wondering how you feel about this.
Oh my gosh, I have a lot to say about this. Well, first of all, when I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, Emmy, and I used to, I was practicing piano and I was learning this one Beethoven, and this one Beethoven piece in particular, she would kick and kick and kick, and I was like, oh, she loves it. And then after she was born, whenever I played that song, she would cry, and I was like, oh no. And anytime I played the piano, it was as though I was turning my attention away from them. So that was hard in the beginning. Writing was a little bit sneakier because you can be in the room and it doesn't sound like you're doing anything, but you're still writing. Most of I felt like, as I said, I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I didn't have the thing to write about. I didn't know what I was going to write about. And I was really surprised when it turned out to be motherhood, and motherhood became the thing that actually
Yeah.
the courage to be a writer, because I thought, I had been so scared of rejection, and I was like, okay, I gave birth without an epidural. I think I can handle a no. It really kind of gave me the courage to take a chance, and I really had like a something that I really felt strongly about, and so writing about them and about my experience of motherhood when they were young was really how my writing career started. But at a certain point, it's not okay. It's not fair to write about your kids. You get sense, you can't just mine your daily life for stories. You want to also be present in your daily life too. So at a certain point, I stopped writing about them. In this book, Zoe is based very much, her voice is very much owes a debt to my daughter Quinn, who is currently 19. And we had a lot of conversations about her experience and working through my thought process on what I wanted to have for Zoe, and she did consent to giving me her life rights to use in the book. But yeah, it's a tricky question. I think it's really hard to sustain a complete idea when you're parenting young children. I think fathers often have the space to do that, and mothers often do not. You have to get really good at grabbing those small moments of time and like not waiting for the muse, but like I've got 2 minutes while this one's asleep and before this one's hungry, so I gotta go. So you have to really become an opportunist and really use that kind of the time that you have. And that can be tricky, especially if you're used to being able to sit and really, mull and work for hours and, finish a complete thought. It takes a lot of patience with yourself, and it takes a lot of energy, but it's not impossible. I mean, I don't think I would have, like I said, my first 4 books were about motherhood and parenting, feminism, and I wouldn't have written them if I didn't have young children,
Here's another incredible line from the book that I loved. The best performance is a lie. And the lie only works if both the performer and the audience believe it. Please say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, specifically thinking about piano, I mean, when it's not like a violin. When you play a violin, the sound sustains, and you can make a vibrato by moving your finger on the string or whatever. When you play the piano, when you hit the note, when you press down the key, that causes a hammer to hit some strings, and then it's done. It's not like the hammer is in continuous contact and making the string vibrate. It hits it once, the string vibrates. And so we have to create this illusion that it's not just like these one-off notes, hammers hitting strings, but actually something continuous, a sound that blends into the next sound. And, it's a magic trick. And it's, if you want to be super reductive about it, it is a lie, right? We're trying to create an illusion is opposite of what, of reality. And, and in the same way, when we give a performance, we've practiced hours and hours and hours and hours, but you can't go out there and sit at the piano in front of an audience and play like you're bored. You can't play like you've done it a million times.
Right.
New. And it has to seem like you're discovering what's amazing about this piece just as the same time as they are hearing you play it. And it's very tricky. And of course, that is also a lie. You've done it a million times. You know what's coming next, So trying to find the surprise, to surprise yourself and surprise the audience is really, really tricky. And, you go as an audience member kind of entering into the lie of knowing like, yeah, this is something that this person has worked on a million times, but there's still that something magical or spontaneous is going to happen in the process of performing it.
I wonder if this has ever happened to you, because it always happens to me when I'm reading, doing or giving a reading. I always change words or lines to make them better. It's like the creativity is always going on, and also it is that feeling of surprise, like, oh, I should have used that word. I mean, has that ever happened to you?
It's hard to stop editing, for sure.
Oh yeah. You have another audience question, which is, what's your favorite piece to play on the piano and why? And I would like to also add, do you compose?
I do not compose. I mean, I took composition classes in at conservatory, but no, that was never my thing. It was fun to learn about though. Gosh, my favorite piece, it really kind of depends. For a while, I really liked this one Rachmaninoff prelude that I really enjoyed playing, and it was meaningful to me because it was the first piece that I learned after my spinal CSF leak, which, had caused this, neurological issues, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to remember things in my head again, so that was very meaningful to me. There's some old repertoire that I return to over and over, probably the Brahms Opus 118 number 2 intermezzo. That has a real special place in my heart because that piece was something that when I learned it as an 18-year-old at the conservatory, I was just kind of going to understand what this kind of music meant, and I had a nice moment in a recital where everything kind of clicked for me. And so that's one that I like to return to just because there's a part of me that still remembers that moment of magic that happened, and it's nice to revisit that, even though I have obviously a much different perspective being 51 now.
You also are the chairman of the Spinal Csf Leak Foundation. Not only did you suffer through this yourself, but you wrote about it in this incredible book, The Beginning of Everything, How I Lost My Mind and Found Myself. And everyone, when you go to your local indie or bookshop.org, order this book. It's remarkable. So it's interesting that you changed and challenged yourself and got some good out of something that and are doing some good out of something that might be a terrible situation. Can you talk about this? Can you talk about how did you find yourself through this?
Yeah, well, okay. It was an interesting surprise in my life, let's say. So basically a spinal CSF leak, it happens when there is a tear in the membrane that covers your brain and spinal cord. And when there is a little tear, that allows cerebrospinal fluid to seep out. I happened to be crossing the street one winter morning in March of 2015, and I coughed. And that was what started it for me. About a week later, I began to get a strange headache, and then it just never let up. I had this softball-sized area of pain in the back of my head, and it was just constant. And it seemed to get better when I laid down, and then when I would stand up, after about 15 minutes, it would be back. Eventually, I started getting other symptoms as well, some neurological issues and other things. I didn't know that a spinal CSF leak could happen. I didn't know that you could get one from cough. I didn't know about spontaneous spinal CSF leaks. But I was very lucky. I was able to go and find a center that was able to treat me, and it worked, and I gradually recovered. But the experience of having the leak was so destabilizing, and I experienced this real sense of groundlessness and selflessness because the me that was me wasn't there. It felt like the me that was normally in charge of myself was this tiny little seed that was just way in the back, wrapped in cotton. And what was actually steering myself through the world was this, brain that was totally separate from my mind. And this question of well, who am I if I'm not there was really profound and existentially terrifying. And it was something that I couldn't even have the capacity to contemplate until I was well on my way to recovery. But writing about the experience of this sudden onset of a neurological disability in the midst of a divorce and being at this crossroads in my life, quite literally, it was a fascinating experience. I think that separation from the self, this kind of dissociation of the self, is something that you might aim for, on the yoga mat or as a spiritual person or a practicing Buddhist. But having it thrust upon you in the context of a neurological illness was really, really destabilizing and unusual and hard to understand. And I was just fascinated, once I was well enough to think about it, by this notion that I kind of had the curtain pulled back, and I saw that my whole life I thought I was the one driving the car, but really I was the toddler in the back seat and steering wheel this whole time. does the brain drive you? Does the mind drive you? Who thinks who's in charge? You know, it was just fascinating stuff to delve into as a writer. And as I worked on the manuscript, I wanted to have the medical parts of it, you know, vetted by somebody who really knew their stuff. So I made contact with the Spinal Csf Leak Foundation and had their medical advisory board chairperson and the founder of the organization read through it and just make sure that I had my medicine right. And eventually I started volunteering with the organization, helping other people tell their stories. And then, you know, gradually just took on more responsibilities. And now I'm executive director.
That's unbelievable. That's so, so great. I have one more question, which is a question I always ask everybody because I'm an obsessive person myself. What's obsessing you now and why?
You know what I'm obsessed with? I'm obsessed with two things. Knitting.
Oh, you knit. I knit too. I didn't know that. Oh, that's great. Okay.
Yeah, I love to knit, and I'm now in like I'm in a knitting phase. So that's, you know, sometimes you go in and out of these. So now I'm in a knitting time, which is fun. Working on a blanket and a couple of little brioche things. I'm obsessed with The Rehearsal. Have you seen that show on HBO?
No.
Yeah, it's a fascinating show by Nathan Fielder. Like, essentially, it's about basically the futility of trying to control your life, but he does it in this way that's really profound. You know, walking people through, you know, absurd simulations of everyday situations that they might have, to the point of building a complete replica of a bar where somebody might go and have a chat with somebody else about a difficult topic. And it's fascinating and it's weird and it feels novelistic in a way, just in the kind of level of absurdity and the poignancy of just like trying to keep all of this social anxiety at bay and how just ultimately futile it is and how you just have to
It is futile.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my current interest.
Oh, I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah.
So I want to thank everybody who came here today. I want to reiterate, you can buy Five Part Invention and all of Andy's books. They're all wonderful. At this, I put the link up on the banner, or at your favorite indie store. I also want to remind you once again about the Salem Literary Fest for September 8th through 11th. You can follow them on Twitter at Salem Lit Fest, Instagram, Salem Lit Fest, TikTok, guess what it is? At Salem Lit Fest, and Facebook, guess what it is? Salem Literary Fest. So thank you all for being here. Andy, it's just so wonderful to see you. And I've been telling everybody about your book because I really think it's a master work.
Oh, thank you so much, Caroline. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for this conversation. It was
You are so welcome. Okay, so goodbye, everybody. Oh, wait, we have one more comment. Let's see what this is. Lisa says, thank you so much, Andrea. I enjoy this. You have a great day and stay safe. So that's lovely. And I'd like to say stay safe to everybody. See you next time.